What do I have to do to be on?
All right, hold on. I'm going to just speak with you. Okay, just do it.
So welcome everyone. I'm Tom Friedland. I'm the president of the Berkeley City Club. And I first want to welcome all of our club members who are here and thank you for continuing to stay with us during these times when the club has not been able to offer as many services as we like to. So we thank you for your loyalty. As you may know, the club is now open for curbside pickup and for terrace dining. We're also offering yoga both on the terrace and virtually. We're offering bocce, and you can order food while you're playing bocce, but you have to do that in person. We can't do it virtually. We're offering as many events as we can do virtually, including the one that we're we will enjoy this evening. For those of you who are not club members, I'd like to invite you to get in touch with me or the club and consider joining. I'd like to invite you to eat at our great restaurant, Julia's, which, as I just said, offers curbside pickup or terrace dining. Our hotel is now open, so you can stay there or you can invite your out-of-town guests or in-town guests to stay with us.
A staycation.
And those of you who are not in the Bay Area, I'd like to invite you to stay with us if you do visit the Bay Area. And with that, I will turn the screen over to my wife, who's the speaker.
Okay. It's an honor to introduce our speaker tonight, and I have already. Oh wait. Yeah. Oh, I'm Sandy Friedland. Sorry. And I'm sorry that I don't have the pleasure of meeting her in person and having a lunch at the City Club, but someday we will do that together, I promise. So Julia Flynn Siler is both an award-winning journalist and an acclaimed best-selling author. She began her journalism career as a correspondent for Business Week in Chicago and LA, and then spent more than 20 years as a London-based foreign correspondent for Business Week and the Wall Street Journal. Over her years abroad, she reported from a dozen countries, and her eclectic subjects ranged from White Castle sliders to biotech, to Richard Branson, the founder of the Virgin Empire, to puppy breeding in between. She and her husband had 2 boys while they were living in London, and she has fond memories of pushing their prams through Hampstead Heath that was near their house. She also managed to take business classes at night while she was there, and actually taught business journalism in Prague. Eventually, she added an MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg Graduate School of Management, and that was on top of her undergraduate degree in American Studies from Brown and her journalism degree from Columbia. A Bay Area native, Julia returned with her family in 2002. One of the first articles she wrote from here for the Wall Street Journal was about the turmoil within the Mondavi family's wine empire, which ran as a front page story in June 2004. That story led to her first book, the New York Times bestseller, The House of Mondavi, The Rise and Fall of an American Wine Dynasty. It was published in 2007, and it's now in its 12th printing. Julia had a long fascination with Hawaii, and she had family friends growing up from Hawaii. And that led her to her second critically acclaimed book, The Lost Kingdom. So Julia likes to have subtitles to her books. So this is The Lost Kingdom, Hawaii's Last Queen, The Sugar Kings, and America's First Imperial Adventure. It's a tale of one of the most breathtaking land grabs of the Gilded Age. It combines stories of royalty, rogues, sugar barons, think San Francisco's Adolph Spreckels, and missionaries, and they're all combined into a sweeping tale of the Hawaiian kingdom's rise and fall. And that brings us to the subject of tonight's program, Julia's new book, The White Devil's Daughters, the women who fought slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown. It's an editor's choice of the New York Times Book Review, and it's a finalist for the California Book Award. The New York Times reviewer calls the book, quote, a solid introduction to an inspiring and yes, heroic struggle against a barbaric practice. Siler has provided a useful, broad view of the fight against slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown, one especially effective in giving voice to previously underappreciated figures. Julia is about to tell you how she discovered this little known chapter of San Francisco history and the brave early feminists who fought to end the enslavement of Chinese women and girls. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Julia Flynn Siler.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. What a lovely introduction. And it's true, I love pushing those prams through Hampstead Heath. I did indeed. And, you know, I hope I can take you up on a rain check to come to the City Club, go to Julia's, and just spend a little time at your club, which looks wonderful. Now, you're frozen. I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yes, I took
Good. Okay, so I am going to tell you, are you okay, Sandy? All good? Good. Okay, so everybody, I'm going to share a screen with you. Give me just a minute to do that. Here we go. Okay. Great. So again, I so appreciate this invitation to speak with you all tonight. It's such a treat to be here, and again, a lovely introduction by Sandy, so thank you very much. I'm here to tell you a really remarkable and true story about a pioneering group of women who fought sex slavery in San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. And the key role that education played in changing the lives of many, many of the girls and women involved in this story. And I think that that's especially apt for a club that is at a university town such as Berkeley. So I spent 5 years working at UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library, which I'm a big supporter of and absolutely love. Stanford Special Collections, the National Archives, both in California and Washington, D.C. And I spent a lot of time tracking down descendants and traveling across the country, including across the pond. And I even made it up to the Highland Archives in Scotland to try to tell the stories of some of these pioneering women. And what I hope is that the story that I discovered has resonance for you today. And that it's an inspiring story. And I think right now we all need a little inspiration, that small changes can make big differences in people's lives. And this is really what this story is about. So without further ado, let's set the stage for the beginning of the story, which is in the 1870s in San Francisco. And this is a photograph, of course, from the city. And just imagine the summer of 1873, cable cars for the first time are rolling up and down the hills of the city. Many of the streets still have cobblestones. At night, they're lit by gas lamps. And it is a city where there's almost continual construction going on. And until recently, very much like what San Francisco was like today. Of course, that's not quite the case anymore. There was also tremendous anti-Asian agitation and violence in those years, the 1870s, and the same kind of racism then directed towards the Chinese that we're seeing right now as well. So the gold rush had ended 2 decades earlier, and the Chinese who'd worked mines and laid railroads across the West were drawn to settle in San Francisco, which was then the capital of Chinese America. I just love this photograph, which is from, I believe it's from the San Francisco History Center, which is on the 6th floor of the San Francisco Public Library. And it seems to capture the chaos of those days. And I particularly love the blurred woman's face in the forefront of this photograph. San Francisco, of course, was an extremely rough port town during those days, with its infamous Barbary Coast vice district. And as one newspaper reporter wrote around that time, it was a town of men and taverns and boarding houses and billiard saloons. It was the cussedest place for women. Now, there were few places that were more cussed for women than Chinatown. And Chinatown was then a very densely packed ghetto in the heart of the city, centered around Portsmouth Square, just like it is today. There were roughly 12,000 people in around 8 square blocks. And the vast majority of those people, as you can see in this photograph, were men. Many of the men from China had come to the United States to lay railroad lines, to dig tunnels, to build so much of the Delta infrastructure that we have today. When those big construction jobs were done, they came back to San Francisco, and they had left their families back in China. So there were also a huge number of brothels in Chinatown in response to a tremendous demand for sex. And that demand came from both Chinese men and from white men. Now, the vast majority of girls and women who lived in Chinatown in the 1860s and the 1870s, at least according to census takers at the time, were prostitutes. Now, a few of those may have chosen sex work as their profession, but the vast majority, scholars believe, were tricked or trafficked into it or sold or otherwise forced into it. And I think it's really important to remember, as this picture gives us a sense, is that so many of the girls and women involved in prostitution during that period of time in the 19th century were extremely young. They were 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. By our standards today, definitionally, they could not have consented to be sex workers. They were generally sold into that situation. And the conditions were absolutely brutal. The average life expectancy of a girl forced into the sex trade was something like 4 years during that period of time, due to disease and abuse and other issues. This is perhaps the most iconic photograph of what was then known as the Chinese slave girl trade. This is a photograph from the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. So Congress had passed the 13th Amendment towards the end of the Civil War, and that, of course, was aimed at ending the slavery of African Americans. Yet during those years, there were open auctions taking place of Asian girls on the streets of San Francisco. And we know this because the newspapers reported them at the time. And there was public outrage of the fact that, hundreds of women were landing on the docks of San Francisco's Embarcadero and being brought up to Chinatown in wagons and then sold off. So there was outrage over this. And eventually those auctions moved to a more private place. And the most part, the more private place, at least in one instance, was known as the Queen's Room. And that was, of course, a bitterly ironic name because it wasn't queenly by any means or royal. It, in fact, was the closest thing to a paddock where the girls were herded together, inspected, and sold off. And I think it's important to make clear that the girls had been trafficked by criminal gangs from China to the West Coast for the most part. But there was plenty of support for the trafficking that was flourishing in the 19th century from white officials, white city officials, immigration officials, policemen. Many of those people were profiting along the way from this business. And it was a very, very lucrative business at this time. So the plight of these trafficked girls and women first came to the attention of the wives of Christian missionaries who were working and living in Chinatown at that time. And they were desperately concerned about the girls and women. And this was a time when there were not a lot of social services. There was not a safety net, especially for the Chinese. And so those women rallied together, a group of mostly middle-class women, and set up a safe house on Sacramento Street. And the first one was a little apartment. And they soon outgrew this. There was great demand for a refuge, a place for girls and women to go to try to escape the sexual slavery in many cases that they were being subjected to. So pretty quickly, though, that group of middle-class women were able to raise enough money to buy this rather large house, which was at 920 Sacramento Street. And 920 Sacramento Street was right in the shadow of Nob Hill. And they bought this house even before the great railroad barons had built their mansions. But even by then, Nob Hill was still a very posh location. This house, or the operation, opened its doors in 1874. And just to give you a little context of how pioneering this really was, Hull House in Chicago, which is probably the most famous settlement house in the United States. It was co-founded, I should say, by the pioneering social worker Jane Addams. This operation started 15 years before Hull House in Chicago opened its doors. And San Francisco's version of a pioneering settlement house operated for 7 decades, so from the 1870s to the 1930s, as a safe house for women who had been trafficked. Now, the women who ran the home began doing what they called rescue work. Now, that's not a term that we would probably use today because it seems to strip away agency from the girls and women who really often sought out the home as a way to find their freedom. But this is a classic photo of so-called rescue work, and it was almost certainly staged for the newspapers at the time. Down below, you see the superintendent of the home. She's looking towards the camera. Standing next to her is almost certainly her colleague, an Asian colleague, probably Chinese colleague, looking up at the young Asian woman in the arms of the policeman. And on the ladder is almost certainly a detective. And in fact, the women very closely worked with police force and the detectives to try to help trafficked women. And they assembled a team. They also had volunteer lawyers. They had as I mentioned, law enforcement personnel, immigration officials. But just to return to the woman whose face you can't see who's standing, the Chinese staffers, and this particular Chinese staffer, they were often on the front lines. They were often the first person to talk to a young woman who was entering the home for the first time, almost certainly only speaking Chinese. And the white women really could not have done their work without their Asian colleagues. There were a few superintendents over the years who did speak some Chinese, but the most famous superintendent, Donaldina Cameron, did not speak Chinese. So she relied very heavily on her Asian colleagues. Now, through my research, I learned that there were between 2,000 and 3,000 residents who stayed at the home from the 1870s to the 1930s. And they ranged in age from babies to young children to women in their 20s and 30s. And this photograph really shows that. You see some very young, in fact, it looks like there's even a boy in this photograph, and that happened occasionally. Sometimes there were boys who stayed there. Some of them were babies who were born to residents at the home. Others were orphans. Increasingly, people would bring their children and drop them off at the steps of the home and say, please take care of our kids. And the women who ran this home hoped to share their Christian faith. although conversion to Christianity was not a requirement for staying in the home. And what the home offered was a safe place, food, board, and probably most importantly, education. There was a very intense educational program that took place there. And in some cases, this is the first place where children learn to read and write. So this small band of faith-based activists, Asian and white, fought the slave trade together for 7 decades. And they were always short of money, yet it's really remarkable how much they achieved together. They testified in front of legislators at the turn of the 20th century. They helped pass one of the first pieces of anti-trafficking legislation in the state of California. And they hosted an enormous number of VIPs, including a presidential party and the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie and his wife, for example. And they, most importantly, raised the issue of the trafficking of Asian girls and women to the public. I mean, what they were doing was of endless fascination to the newspapers and magazines at the time. Oops. So the person who became the public face of the home was named a very old-fashioned name, Donaldina Cameron, and her Scottish family called her Dolly. This is a photograph of Dolly at age 25. And I just love this photograph so much. I think I've now seen probably every photograph that exists of Donaldina Cameron. Her family very kindly shared a big trunk load of family materials with me. But I never again saw her with white gloves and delicate netting over her face. Because pretty much as soon as she arrived at the home at the age of 25, ostensibly to teach sewing, she literally rolled up her sleeves, took off all her fancy clothes and put on work clothes and got to work. And she really didn't stop working for the next 40 years. And she lived a life where she was working and living 24 hours a day in a very large group home with as many as 60 residents coming and going at any one time. And it could often be chaotic. Things did not always go well. And there were threats to the home and threats personally to her for what she was doing, because essentially she was trying to disrupt a very profitable business at that point in time. So she was really so effective at disrupting the business of human trafficking that her enemies in Chinatown came to call her the White Devil. And of course, they use that term in the Chinese. That's where the title of my book comes from, The White Devil's Daughters. And of course, the White Devil is a racial epithet, and it was meant to scare girls and young women from seeking Dolly Cameron out and trying to escape to the home. Now, at the same time, some of the girls and women in the home came to call her Lo Mo, or mother. And that is the second part of the title. As Sandy kindly noted, I do like subtitles, and the subtitle for this book is The Women Who Fought Slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown. Sorry, The White Devil's Daughters is the title, but the daughters refer to the many residents and also colleagues who worked alongside Dolly and other women at the home. And one of the most kind of remarkable things I found, I stumbled across in the Stanford archives. And what I found there was a folder, and the folder had many, many Mother's Day cards that former residents had written to Dolly Cameron from all across the country, because once residents moved out of the home, they might move to the Midwest or to New York or back to China. And they would send her Mother's Day cards, and they were really touching. And they often thanked her for what she had done for them. Okay. So as I As I mentioned, Dolly and her multicultural team faced many threats and challenges over the years, including the quarantine of Chinatown in 1900, starting 1900, 1901, because of an outbreak of bubonic plague that lasted for several years. And this photograph really captures so dramatically one of the most terrifying episodes and challenges that the women of the home faced. And of course, that was the 1906 earthquake and the firestorms that erupted after that earthquake. And it was really Dolly's first person account of leading the residents of the home through the burning city. And her very, very gritty and gripping account of the smell in the air, the sense of chaos, the fear people were feeling, that made me want to write this book. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I have been to that area of the city many, many times. And I wanted to know more about that home and the women and the girls who lived there. And it also was an opportunity because it was an institution that had operated for so long and kept great records of its operations and the people who passed through its doors. And so as a historian, there was really an opportunity to write a rich story that covered a lot of time in San Francisco's history as well. I was so fascinated as well by the grit and resilience of the women who passed through those doors. I just thought it'd be a great story. So that's why I was interested in writing the book. So I'm going to tell you a few of the stories of the women who passed through. And this is where we get to the uplifting part, and I hope the inspiring part. And one of the great pleasures for me of this book is that I have gotten to know some of the descendants of these remarkable women in the course of reporting the White Devil's Daughters and also talking about it. I'm going to tell you their stories, and I hope you'll ask some questions about them too afterwards. So one of the young women who was among the band of earthquake refugees in April of 1906 was this woman pictured here, and her name was Tai Leong. And she was sold by her family as a child servant, known as a mutsi. She ran away to the rescue home at the age of 12 to avoid an arranged marriage. And she gained an education at the home. She became a translator there, translating for immigration officials and in court proceedings. And eventually she became the first Chinese American woman to work at Angel Island when it opened in 1910. And Angel Island, of course, was the immigration station in the San Francisco Bay. So Ty's story is quite remarkable. She fell in love with a man who was a fellow immigration officer at Angel Island. And at that time in California, there were laws that prohibited Chinese people from marrying white people. They were called anti-miscegenation laws. And so Ty and her husband-to-be decided to follow the letter of the law, went to Washington State and married there, where it was legal for them to marry. They came back, and promptly they both lost their immigration jobs on Angel Island. They were enormously resilient people. They found other jobs. And in fact, this newspaper photograph was taken not too long after they had lost their jobs. And the caption of this photograph is, quote, is describing Ty, quote, as a progressive Chinese American woman. And the reason for putting her in the newspaper was that she had cast a vote in the presidential primary in 1912. She was born in America. And, you know, it could be, it's hard to tell, but we believe she may be certainly, if not the first Chinese American woman to cast a vote in a presidential election, one of the first for sure. And as those of you who are thinking about the 100th anniversary of suffrage this year, just a reminder that California was way ahead of many other states in giving suffrage to women. That's why she could vote in 1912. But this photograph, it has a kind of funny story behind it too. I got so much help for this book along the way. And one of the historians who was enormously generous to me is Judy Young, who's just a treasure in the city of San Francisco. She at one point was a Chinatown librarian and then became a highly respected historian of Asian American women. And so Judy very kindly provided me with this photograph, but she noted that, in fact, Ty never learned how to drive. And this was completely staged, the idea that she was behind the wheel of a car like that. And keep in mind as well that almost certainly Ty's feet did not reach the pedals. Ty was very short-statured. She was perhaps 4'5", according to her grandson, Ted Schultze, who I've gotten to know a little bit. And Ty was just recently the subject of a short documentary in PBS, American Master Series, that both I and her grandson Ted were in, talking about her experience. But anyways, a remarkable figure from Bay Area history. And it's just amazing how she got herself to the home and changed her life. And I think that's pretty inspiring. So here's another woman, again, who really blossomed at the home. And her name was Bessie Jiang. She too had fled an arranged marriage in China, and she ran away to the home at the age of 15. And it quickly became clear to the staffers at the home that Bessie had a very gifted mind. She was very unusual in her ability to learn. So with their help, she not only was one of the first Chinese American women to study at a largely white high school, elite high school in San Francisco, but then she went to Stanford University with their help. And remember, she has no money, so these women are raising money to help put her through Stanford University. Her freshman year, she was having a lot of difficulties with some of the subject matter. They got her a tutor. And one of my reporting kind of triumphs was tracking down her yearbook photograph from 1927. And that's what you see there, is her yearbook photograph. She didn't stop there. She then went to medical school and she became a pioneering Chinese American female doctor who was, again, one of the first Chinese American female doctors to have a residency at a big hospital in Los Angeles. She was very grateful to the opportunities that the home gave her. And this is a photograph of her later in life. And she came back as a doctor to volunteer with some of the younger residents of the home. And that's what that's showing. So Bessie Jiang, Dr. Bessie Jiang. Oh, there's actually a funny story I would love to share with you too about Bessie, which is that this was the era, the 20s and 30s, when people were a little reluctant to go to a woman doctor at all. And so in the San Francisco phone directory, she listed her name as Dr. B. Jiang. And there was an oral history of her at Stanford. And she said, well, people would come to my office and they'd be startled to see it was a woman, but then they would be too embarrassed to turn around. So that's how she got some more patients. Anyways, now this is another incredible story. And one of the challenges of writing this history was that very few women who'd been trafficked left written records of their experiences behind. I mentioned earlier the mortality rate of women who'd been trafficked to the West Coast, the average life expectancy of something like 4 years in those conditions. But one of the women who found her freedom in the home and wrote so movingly of the experience of being trafficked and then finding her way to freedom was a Japanese woman named, she had a number of different names, but later in life, she came to be known as Yamada Waka. So Yamada Waka was trafficked through Seattle and then San Francisco. And she took refuge at the home at the turn of the century. And she also gained an education there. She ended up marrying the Japanese tutor that the home helped arrange for her. And the two of them returned to Japan shortly before the earthquake struck in 1906. In Japan, she became a leading writer, and she also helped set up a safe house for women who've been trafficked or prostitutes in other situations, modeled on the one that had helped her so much in 920 Sacramento Street in San Francisco. Now, this photograph is from the US Library of Congress. It's a photograph, as you probably could tell, taken in front of the White House in Washington, D.C., and it was taken in 1937. And Yamada Waka was invited by Eleanor Roosevelt to come visit her. She was on a book tour at the time. And if there's a single life story that illustrates how one can change the trajectory of your life, Yamada Waka's story is probably it. So, okay, this is probably my favorite story, though. This is a young girl named Tien Fu Wu. And she arrived at 920 Sacramento Street at the home in about 15 months before Dolly Cameron got there. And she had come from China. She had been sold by her father, who was facing terrible gambling debts. He sold her to someone. She was shipped to San Francisco on a steamer and ended up working as a child servant in a brothel. She was not prostituted. She was too young at that point, but she was working as a servant there. For whatever reason, we don't know exactly why, the brothel sold her to somebody else. The other person had badly abused her and was burning her with hot iron on her arms. And her abuse came to the attention of authorities, who brought her to the house at 920 Sacramento Street. And education, again, played such a key role in her story. Through the home, she found a sponsor. The sponsor helped pay for her to attend an elite boarding school in the Philadelphia area, and even to go to college for a time in Toronto. Now, Tien wanted to find her family. She particularly wanted to find her beloved grandmother and her mother to try to see if she had any family left. But of course, China at the turn of the 20th century was in a tremendous tumult. There was civil war, there was incredible strife, there was famine, and she could not locate her family. So she did some deep thinking, and she realized that she'd spent her entire childhood in that group home on Sacramento Street. And she decided the thing to do was to go back there and to join as a staffer. And so she did. And she became Dolly's key aide. She would run the home when Dolly was out fundraising or when Dolly was meeting fancy people. Tien was in charge. She would translate in court. She would travel across the country to check on former residents who'd gotten married. She was known as a strict taskmaster. But she worked there for a very, very long time, into the 1940s, even after Dolly Cameron had retired. And as I mentioned, I traveled a lot for my research for this book. And one of the most moving places that I went to was the Cameron family plot in Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. And both Tien and Dolly are in this family plot. And in life, they became each other's closest friends. They spent the last years of their life together. And my book is, in one sense, about their very unusual friendship and their role as comrades to each other in this fight against sex slavery. And it's pretty amazing that they are now buried together as well. And these gravestones to me are also a reminder of how close this history really is to us. I mean, Dolly Cameron, as you can see, she was born in 1869, but she only died in 1968. She almost lived 100 years. And she spent many decades in the Palo Alto area. There's a park named after her, and there's still family all over the Bay Area, her family. Tien, even more recently, she only died in 1975 in San Francisco. And I was able to interview people who remembered Auntie Wu and could tell me stories about what she was like, and likewise remembered Dolly Cameron. So the history is really, really close to us. So the house at 920 Sacramento Street is still there today. This is a photograph that I took shortly before the book was published. And it's a key social services agency in Chinatown. It does really important work. There's a food pantry that is vital to that community that operates weekly. A lot of English as a second language education, all kinds of stuff. It still sometimes handles cases involving sex trafficking as well. And as I mentioned before, it does do education for new immigrants. And while we describe what those pioneering women did as opening a safe house for survivors of sex trafficking, that's really not what they called what their work was. They called it woman's work for woman. They saw it as an early kind of feminist effort to help vulnerable people in their communities. And remember, this was at a time when most part, their husbands, their pastors, they were not supporting this project. So they were swimming against the tide to reach out their hands and try to help people who really needed help. And what motivated those women to do that? Well, I think it was faith and compassion. And it was the same kind of compassion that motivated the abolitionists who fought to end the transatlantic slave trade in African slaves. And I really hope that you find their stories as inspiring as I did. Because for me, this story shows how a relatively small group of people acting on their consciences can really bring about the changes in literally thousands of people's lives. And as well as the key role that education can play in changing the trajectory of someone's life. So I'm so grateful for you listening to me, and I would be delighted to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Julia. That was awesome. I have one quick question, and then I'll start taking them. If you put, wait, let me get our camera on for a second. So if those of you in the audience, if you have a question, please write it out in the chat function and I will read it. Julia, tell us about the East Bay connection.
Oh, yes, I forgot to mention that. So there's a really strong East Bay connection in this book. The house started getting so crowded that Dolly, as superintendent, realized that they needed more room. They really needed more room. And so they opened up another house, a second house for the younger residents in the East Bay. And it was known as Ming Quong Home. And it was originally in Oakland. And the first time around, it was in a just awful, awful area of Oakland. It was really stinky. I think it was near I don't know what it was, but it was something, it was not good at all. And there was a donor, his name was Robert Dollar, who those who are, kind of fans of San Francisco history will know his name because he was a steamship owner. He owned the biggest steamship line between San Francisco and China. And he put up the money to hire the wonderful architect, Julia Morgan, who designed a really nice, yay, Julia is even in the book. So Julia Morgan, who designed this beautiful, beautiful, home, which is now part of the Julia Morgan School for Girls. And the Ming Quong Home, meanwhile, sold that property and then moved to the peninsula. And it's still operating today as well. I just did a talk for kind of the people who support the home in its current iteration. It's no longer a home, but it's a support service for vulnerable youth. So,
Julia, I assume you know that the Berkeley City Club was designed by Julia Morgan.
I do.
Okay.
Yes, I should have mentioned it. Sorry about that.
I have a question for you, Julia. Do you know
Yeah.
anything about the treatment they got on their passage over the Pacific?
The treatment that they got. You're talking about the trafficked women.
Yes. What happened on
Yes.
the boat?
Yes, I do know something about that. And I'll tell you, I suspect that the treatment depended on the intended customers for the trafficked women. So the cases that I am most familiar with are cases of very elite trafficked women who came under false papers as paper daughters, and were often schooled very carefully in how to speak and what their families were like. And they were basically coming under false pretenses that they were merchants' daughters. And therefore, when they got off the ship, they had beautiful clothes, they had been treated well, and as in their guise of being a merchant's daughter, they would have stayed in much better accommodations than the women who were being brought via steerage. In the early days, in the 1860s and 1870s, those hundreds of women who were getting off at the docks, they were staying in steerage because that was more of a bulk operation of bringing many, many women in. So the instance that I'm talking about, instances of the paper daughters, was slightly later into the 20th century.
Good. Okay, this is from Cynthia Larson. Will you please describe the investigatory process in preparing the book? For example, how did you approach potential interviews?
Sure, that's a really great question. The first person I approached was a remarkable woman who since become my hero. Honestly, I really admire her a lot. Her name's Doreen Durr McLeod. She's been honored in the San Francisco Bay Area as a very inspiring social services worker on her own. And she's the former executive director of what's now known as Cameron House. She must be in her 70s these days. In any case, she's a Chinese woman, and she organized those 3,000 case files. So she was the key person who understood the documents that are still in the home today. So in terms of my reporting, I really needed to convince her that I would treat this subject with respect. And over the years, different writers had come and gone, and everybody had tried to get into those case files. She became convinced, I worked with her for 5 years on this project, that I would treat it with respect. And so I didn't see every single one of those thousands of files, but I did see quite a few of those cases. So I hope that answers the question.
So this is from Joanne and Marty Lorber. Why was the mortality rate for young women so high? Was there any issue with drug usage among the women?
The mortality rate was high because there's so many ways to answer this question. The women would be, if they were entertaining, that's an awful word to use. If they were being forced to have sex with 10 to 12 to 14 men a night at the age of 12, they are going to pick up diseases. At the same time, in San Francisco in those years, most hospitals would not treat the Chinese. It took a while for a specific Chinese hospital to be opened in Chinatown. And so one of the most horrifying, and I don't usually bring it up in book talks, but most horrifying things that I came across in this research was that there were also reasons that once a girl became abused or became diseased, and the person who had invested in her would not want to pay or take off the time to care for her to get her back to health. And so there are just absolutely horrifying descriptions of young girls being left on the streets to die during those years. And I think that's one of the things that outraged some of the activists who spoke out about it, the journalists who wrote about it, and the women who set up this home. I mean, can you imagine walking down the street and there's a young woman? And I guess we see this now in San Francisco and in Berkeley, but it was pretty horrifying. Drug use, yes. So the same dynamic that we see in trafficking now, which is that often opium or some other sorts of substances would be involved in what was going on with the women who were being trafficked.
Okay, Molly Montgomery, could you unmute yourself and ask this question yourself? I think it's so interesting that you should pose it in person. Molly Montgomery.
Oh, yes, thank you. So I just wanted to thank the author, because I've been reading this book this whole summer, and it's been super enlightening because my grandma grew up in the Ming Quong Home in Oakland in the 1930s. So just like learning the backstory of how the mission home came about has been so interesting to me. And I was just wondering, because I'm mixed race myself, and I know that some of the women who are prostitutes service white men as well.
Yes.
So were there any mixed race people did you ever come across any stories of mixed race people in the mission home or in the orphanages?
Definitely in the orphanages, there were mixed race people, and the mission home, I'm trying to think of the particular cases that I wrote about. I have no doubt that there were, but I didn't write specifically about it. Yeah, so but that's a great question, Molly. Thank you. And how amazing. There's a book. There are actually a couple of books about Ming Quong. You've probably seen them. Chopstick Childhood. And
Yeah. I'm actually trying to write a novel about my grandmother's experience. So your book has been so helpful to me. So thank you.
Fantastic. Good luck. I think that's such a great project.
Okay, so I had another fairly quick question, and it may be obvious from what you said, but did Dolly or Tien ever marry?
Oh, I should have mentioned that too. I always think of all the things. Thank you for asking that. No, neither of them ever married. Dolly was engaged 3 different times. The last time she was engaged to a very, very wealthy man who was much, much older than she was. And before they got married, he died. And so that is one of the, his bequest and the bequest of his family was one of the things that helped support the home over the years. Took her home. It was originally, Ming Quong was originally named the Took Her Home, thanks to her fiance. And for Tien, I don't know, Tien had a very kind of funny, sardonic view of men. And as a young girl, a young woman, she was very beautiful, I think. She had quite a beauty to her, but it's not clear to me she ever wanted to get married. People have asked me whether it's possible that Dolly and Tien were lovers, and I don't know the answer. My gut instinct is probably not. They were probably very, very close friends in the way, you may, Sandy, have done some work with Estelle Friedman at Stanford and her writing and a scholarship around the issue of women's friendships. But I suspect that their friendship was a kind of Victorian era, very close women's friendship.
So we're getting lots of thank yous. Fantastic, great talk, eloquently presented. I'll triple go with that. I guess I had another question. Did these women connect with any of the other feminist or suffragist movements or any of the other things going on with women's social organizations in the Bay Area?
That's a really, again, a really great question. And I didn't see a lot of connections. And the closest connection I saw was, for example, an early supporter of the home was, oh God, what is her name again? I'm blanking on her full name, Hearst. Phoebe Hearst.
Yes.
And Phoebe Hearst, the connection there, of course, is Phoebe Hearst, as well as Jane Stanford, were very involved in the kindergarten project. So they were very involved in creating kindergartens across the Bay Area and an early education for children, children's welfare. And so to the extent that this home and this project also involved children, there was a little bit of overlap. But in terms of suffrage, not really. I did not see evidence of that. And I'm kind of surprised. The closest thing I saw was Thai in that, in the news, landing in the newspapers as the first Chinese American woman to vote.
Okay, are there any other questions? Anyone? You can unmute yourself and ask it yourself if you'd like. Any other questions? It looks like maybe not. Well, no, just more thank yous and very interesting. You're a terrific presenter, Julia, and I think we're all so excited and grateful that we could hear you talk about this with such passion and enthusiasm, not a single and
Well, thank you.
It's obvious how much you love this project. What's your next one?
Oh, well, I'm sticking with my turn of the 20th century time period, which I absolutely love. I feel like my book on Hawaii was exactly that same time. The book, so much of it is that time. And I'm going to focus on a unsolved murder mystery involving one of California's most famous families. And my hope is maybe I can solve the mystery, but we'll see. We'll see.
Okay.
So thank you very much for this opportunity.
There's a lot of thank you, great talk, wonderful talk. Thank you for making it happen. It's our pleasure. Thank you so much. And on our promo and in the Berkeley City Club newsletter, those of you who are members, there are links to Julia's books and ways to buy them. It's not too hard to find, just Google her and you can find links to buying her books. And I hope that you get some sales and some new fans from this.
Oh, thanks. Well, actually the most helpful thing, forgive me if this sounds craven, but if anybody wants to write reviews on Amazon or something, that would be super helpful. It's all about the algorithms, baby. It's like the new world of being a writer.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. It was really
Bye-bye.
a pleasure.
Hope to meet you in person sometime.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everyone. We had a good audience, more than in person, by the way.
Oh, good. I'm delighted. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.